Good afternoon, Steelers Nation. Right now, what's happening inside the Pittsburgh Steelers organization is more layered than it might look on the surface. And if you're paying attention to the details coming out of this post-draft period, you can start to see a very intentional structure forming, one that's balancing present competition with long-term uncertainty. Let's start with something that caught a lot of fans off guard, the reaction tied to 7th round pick Eli Heidenreich. When Art Rooney II spoke about him, the phrase best 7th rounder sparked immediate debate, but internally this wasn't strictly about projecting him as a future star when compared to names like Brett Keisel or Kelvin Beachum. It was about the full circle moment, a Pittsburgh native, a Naval Academy player drafted by his hometown team in a draft hosted in Pittsburgh, walking onto that stage with the terrible towel in hand. That moment mattered, and sometimes inside this organization, those moments carry weight beyond raw scouting grades. But if you zoom out, the real story is how this roster is being quietly assembled. Look at the offensive line projection right now. Without training camp even starting, there's already a working idea of how things could line up. Dylan Cook and Troy Fautanu competing on the edges, Gennings Dunker sliding into a key interior role, Zach Frazier anchoring at center, and Mason McCormick rounding things out. What stands out here isn't just the names, it's the balance between youth and caution. There's a clear hesitation to throw multiple rookies into starting roles immediately, something tied directly to the philosophy now shaping this team under Mike McCarthy. And that brings us to the draft strategy, which has been heavily questioned by parts of the fan base. Some people are calling it confusing, others even labeling it as a setup for failure. But internally, that narrative doesn't fully hold up. The Steelers didn't just sit back and pick, they moved. They traded up in the 2nd round to get Gurmy Bernard, and again in the 3rd to secure Gennings Dunker. That tells you these weren't passive selections, these were targeted moves. And when you look at external evaluations, the picture becomes even more interesting. Multiple analysts gave this class an A grade, pointing to the physical upside of players like Maxi Hanashore, the versatility of Bernard, and the long-term potential of prospects like Aller and Everett. There's acknowledgement that not every pick is polished right now, but the tools are there, the traits are there, and that's a recurring theme with this front office. Now, here's where things get even more intriguing. The quarterback situation. For years, the conversation around this franchise has circled one question. Where is the next true franchise quarterback? When Ben Roethlisberger was drafted, it ended a 20-year gap since Terry Bradshaw's retirement. 20 years. That's not just a stat, that's a reminder of how long these searches can take. And today, that uncertainty hasn't completely disappeared. The roster situation even hints at it. There's an expectation, not a confirmation, but a strong expectation that Aaron Rodgers could occupy one of the remaining roster spots. At the same time, there's space being deliberately held open, possibly for a standout from rookie minicamp or a late addition. That tells you the Steelers are not closing doors yet. They're leaving options open. Even the 90-man roster math reflects that mindset. Draft picks who haven't signed are still being counted because realistically, they're not going anywhere before camp. Meanwhile, 1 or 2 spots remain flexible, not by accident, but by design. And then there's the broader roster building philosophy. The Steelers appear largely done with major free agent moves heading into training camp. That's a signal. It suggests confidence in what they've assembled, or at least a commitment to evaluating this group before making any more external investments. So when fans say they don't get the draft, the reality might be this. The plan isn't meant to be obvious right now. It's layered, it's developmental, it's betting on traits, depth, and internal competition rather than immediate headlines. But that approach always comes with risk, because if those traits don't translate, if those projections don't hit, then suddenly what looks like a calculated strategy can quickly be seen as a missed opportunity. And that's the line the Steelers are walking today. So the real question for you watching this is simple. Are the Steelers building something sustainable with this approach, or are they overcomplicating a roster that needed more immediate answers? And that's exactly where the tension starts to build, because once you understand that this roster is being constructed with patience and projection in mind, you also start to see how thin the margin for error really is. Take a closer look at how the Steelers handled their total draft capital. They came into the process with 12 picks, but only made 10 actual selections. That alone might seem insignificant at first glance, but it tells a deeper story. Those missing picks weren't lost. They were invested. Moving up in the 2nd round for Gurmy Bernard, and again in the 3rd for Gennings Dunker shows a front office that wasn't willing to sit back and hope their targets would fall. They identified specific players and went to get them. That's aggressive. That's deliberate. But it also raises expectations immediately, because when you trade up, you're not just drafting talent, you're committing to it. Now layer that onto a roster that already has internal questions, especially in key areas like wide receiver depth, offensive line stability, and long-term quarterback planning. You begin to see the bigger picture forming. This isn't a plug-and-play draft class. This is a class that needs time, development, and the right environment to succeed. And that's where training camp becomes critical. Right now, even the projected offensive line we talked about earlier is just that, a projection. There's no guarantee that Dylan Cook holds off Troy Fautanu or that Gennings Dunker immediately locks down his role without growing pains. The same goes for every other young piece added to this roster. The Steelers are clearly trying to avoid starting multiple rookies too early, which reflects a level of caution. But at the same time, if those rookies prove ready faster than expected, it could force changes sooner than planned. That internal competition is going to define a lot of what this team becomes in 2026. And then there's another subtle but important layer, roster flexibility. The way the Steelers are managing the 90-man roster right now is not random. Even though drafted players haven't officially signed, they're being treated as part of the group because, realistically, their spots are secure. But beyond that, there's intentional space being preserved. One of those open spots is likely being held for a standout from rookie minicamp, a tryout player who forces his way into the conversation. That's something this organization has always valued, giving opportunities to unexpected contributors. At the same time, the idea of bringing in a veteran, whether it's at wide receiver or another position, hasn't been completely ruled out, but it doesn't seem to be the priority anymore. The Steelers appear comfortable heading into camp with what they have, which again reinforces that belief in internal development over external fixes. Even the structure of rookie minicamp itself plays into this. It's not just about drafted players getting their first reps. It's a mix of rookies, undrafted signings, and first-year players who've never been under contract before. It's a controlled environment, but also a proving ground. And historically, that's where you sometimes find pieces that weren't part of the original plan. So when you connect all of this, the traded picks, the developmental prospects, the cautious approach to starting roles, the open roster spots, and the limited interest in late free agent additions, what you're really looking at is a team that's betting heavily on its evaluation process. They believe they've identified the right traits. They believe they've brought in the right competition. And most importantly, they believe that this group, as constructed, can evolve into something stronger over time. But here's the part that can't be ignored. Belief doesn't always translate to results. Because if even a few of these key projections don't develop the way they expect, if the offensive line struggles to find consistency, if the skill players don't create enough impact, or if the quarterback situation remains unresolved longer than anticipated, it's then the entire timeline of this rebuild, or retool, whatever you want to call it, starts to shift. And in the NFL, timelines matter. You don't always get the luxury of waiting. So now everything points forward to training camp and the early part of the season, where theory turns into reality. That's where we'll start to see whether this approach is ahead of its time, or just too risky for a team that's trying to stay competitive right now. If you've followed everything up to this point, you can see both sides of it. There's a clear plan, there's structure, there's intent, but there's also uncertainty at some of the most important positions on the field. And that's what makes this such a fascinating moment for the Steelers. And this is where everything starts to accelerate, because once the pads come on and real competition begins, the Steelers won't be able to operate in projections anymore. They'll have to make decisions. Decisions about who actually gives them the best chance to win now, not just who might develop into something later. That's especially true when you look at how fragile certain position battles could become. On the offensive line, for example, the idea of easing rookies into starting roles sounds smart in theory, but what happens if one of those younger players clearly outperforms a veteran in camp? Do you stick to the cautious plan, or do you adjust immediately? That's the kind of internal conflict that can shape the identity of a team very quickly. And it doesn't stop there. The ripple effect of those decisions touches everything. The running game, the protection schemes, even the confidence level of whoever lines up at quarterback. Because at the end of the day, no matter how much attention goes to skill players or draft grades, it's the cohesion of the offensive unit that determines whether this team can actually execute at a high level. Now bring the quarterback situation back into focus. there's still a sense that the Steelers are managing this position with flexibility rather than certainty. The possibility of Aaron Rodgers being part of the equation adds intrigue, but it doesn't eliminate the long-term question. If anything, it highlights it even more, because if Rodgers is brought in, that's a short-term play. It buys time. It stabilizes the present, but it doesn't necessarily answer the future. And if he's not brought in, then the spotlight becomes even brighter on the younger options in the room, especially someone like Aller, who was described as a high upside prospect, but not a fully polished product coming out. That's a gamble. A calculated one, but still a gamble. And this is where you start to understand the dual track approach the Steelers are taking. On one side, they're trying to remain competitive right now. They're not tearing things down. They're not entering a full rebuild, but on the other side, they're clearly investing in players who might not peak immediately. That creates a natural tension between urgency and patience. And in the NFL, balancing those two things is one of the hardest challenges any organization faces. Because if you lean too far into patience, you risk wasting opportunities in the present. But if you chase the present too aggressively, you can compromise the future. Right now, the Steelers are trying to walk directly between those two paths. And that brings us back to something that can't be ignored: the expectations tied to this draft class. When analysts hand out A grades, when the front office makes aggressive moves to secure specific players, when the organization signals confidence in its internal development, and all of that builds pressure, not just externally from fans and media, but internally as well. These players aren't stepping into a quiet situation. They're stepping into a roster where their development is going to matter almost immediately, even if they're not all starting right away. And that's why the early weeks of the season are going to be so telling, not just in terms of wins and losses, but in how this team looks, how it functions, how quickly these pieces come together, or don't. Because if things click faster than expected, suddenly this draft class starts to look like a foundation for something sustainable and dangerous. But if there are inconsistencies, if the offense struggles to find rhythm, if the young players take longer to adjust, then the conversation shifts. And it shifts quickly. That's the reality of the NFL. So as we move forward, every practice rep, every preseason snap, every depth chart adjustment, it's all going to be part of a bigger evaluation. Not just of the players, but of the strategy itself. Was this the right way to build? Was this the right mix of aggression and patience? Was this the right bet on upside over certainty? We're about to find out. If you've stayed with me through this entire breakdown, you already know. Now, this isn't just about a draft class. It's about the direction of the Pittsburgh Steelers as a whole. And as this continues to unfold, there's another layer that hasn't gotten enough attention yet. How this coaching staff is going to manage expectations inside the locker room while all of this is happening, because it's one thing to talk about development and long-term upside from the outside. It's another thing entirely when you have veterans in that building who are competing right now, who are fighting for roles, contracts, and relevance. When younger players are being given opportunities based on projection, that naturally creates pressure on the more experienced guys to respond. And that internal dynamic can either elevate a team or divide it. This is where leadership becomes critical, not just from the coaching staff, but from the players themselves. The Steelers have always prided themselves on stability, on culture, on having a clear identity. But when you introduce this level of transition, new draft investments, open competitions, uncertainty at quarterback, that identity gets tested. And it's not tested in press conferences. It's tested in practice. It's tested when a rookie starts taking first team reps. It's tested when a veteran gets pushed down the depth chart. It's tested when results don't immediately match expectations. And that's why the early tone of this team is going to matter so much. If the competition stays healthy, if players buy into the process, if the coaching staff manages rotations and opportunities the right